My name is Emily, and I just want to say hello to everyone. Some of you may know me, some of you may not, but I am Emily. I'm a science educator with Driving Discovery. Salut tout le monde, je suis Emily. Je suis une éducatrice en sciences avec le moteur de la découverte. And today I'm going to walk you through the Driving Discovery workshop development process. And after we go through a little bit of what our process is, I want to go through with you and we can develop our own learning experience all together. So with that being said, since I'm hoping to get everyone engaged all together and putting forth ideas, I really want to encourage you to participate in the chat. So put forth any questions you have. I'll be asking for suggestions on things or ideas of how to implement certain things in your classroom. So please put forth anything that comes to mind. We'll try to get to everybody's comments, but it would be really best if everyone was participating so we can all get a little something out of it. All right, so how does Driving Discovery develop inquiry-based resources? Well, it may not come as a surprise to you since this session is titled Skillification 101, but we use the curriculum skills. So all of our workshops and additional resources are directly tied to the curriculum outcomes and indicators. And they follow the scaffolding of the curriculum skills. So essentially, we just follow the steps and the process outlined by each of the skills in the curriculum. And all of these processes have the goal of promoting inquiry in your learners. So like Zabrina was talking about, if you're a little apprehensive about the implementation of inquiry-based learning, really, as long as you're following the skills, as long as you're doing those steps and focusing on hitting those components, you're doing inquiry-based learning. So it takes some of the stress off of you. You don't have to be super creative. You just have to follow those steps. And that's what we're hoping to show you today. All right. It's sometimes not super easy to think about how to implement those skills, though. So let's take you through our process. I'm going to start sharing my screen with you so you can see what I'm talking about. And then we'll talk you through how to develop workshops and learning experiences that not only cover the relevant curriculum concepts, but include the skills so you can be sure that you're providing your learners with an inquiry-based learning experience that's really valuable to them. All right, so I'm going to start presenting my screen. Awesome. All right, so these steps outline the process that we take to develop a learning experience that includes the curriculum skills. Now, we don't necessarily follow this in order to a T every single time, but overall, these are the things that we keep in mind when we're developing learning experiences. So first, we choose an outcome, we choose an indicator, we decide what we're going to be talking about, what sort of concepts we want to focus on, what content we will be covering. And then within that, we review the available skills. So each section of the curriculum has different skills listed. And so we want to make sure that we're choosing a skill that's relevant to that part of the curriculum. And then we want to develop driving questions. So we try to frame it in a way that we can guide the learners through the learning experience without giving them the answers and sort of prompting them to develop their own questions as well. And then we move on to planning the actual activity. So based on the skill that we've chosen and the steps within that scaffolding, we can start to think about what sorts of things we want the learners to actually be doing. And then after that, we choose a timeline. Typically for Driving Discovery, our timeline is 1 class period. So that'll be very different for you depending on what your needs are in your classroom. But typically, all of our resources are for 1 hour at a time. Ideally, you could stretch that out to fit quite a bit longer of a timeline. And then once we've got sort of everything outlined in the way that we like, we go through and we make sure that we're allowing for inquiry as much as possible. So we're asking a lot of questions. We're allowing for space for learners to make mistakes and to fail and to recognize what they're doing wrong so that they can do better the next time. So to put this in context, to give you a better idea of really what it would look like, we'll go through briefly the process of developing the greenhouse effect, which is one of our workshops through Driving Discovery. So when we first developed the greenhouse effect, it was made for grade 7. We tried to focus on an area of the curriculum that teachers felt they needed support in. And in this case, it was the engineering structures unit. So we later modified the workshop to be available as a resource for grade 8. So you'll see on the left side is the grade 7 curriculum, and on the right side is the grade 8 curriculum. And this modification from grade 7 to grade 8 was pretty easy because we found that the greenhouse effect to begin with had quite a heavy climate focus. So we went from engineering structures and talking about forces that affect structures over to more of the climate change focus content for the grade 8 part. Now, choosing an outcome and an indicator really depends on where you are in the curriculum. This will depend on the time of year, what you're feeling like tackling with your students, what you've learned already, and maybe what you feel that they're ready to continue learning. And this will also shape the background information that you put forward to your learners. So sometimes, like with the greenhouse effect, learners are new to that concept. So especially in grade 7, they might not be comfortable talking about the greenhouse effect yet. So we want to make sure we're giving them just enough background information to put the workshop into context. So what does it really mean? What are we doing? How can I really understand this? And then once we chose our section of the curriculum, we were able to review the skills that were there. And once again, on the left are the grade 7 skills for this section of the curriculum, and on the right are the grade 8 skills. Now, we chose construct and create because we had a vision of having learners actually doing something, building something, and having a physical model at the end. But these skills are pretty heavy duty, pretty intense. They were the overall outcome skill, so it encompasses quite a few components. And if you're not feeling ready to tackle an entire skill all at once, totally understand, you don't have to do that. So the skills are broken down into their components. So if you're ready to start thinking about constructing something with your learners, but you're not ready to go through, identify a purpose, brainstorm ideas, identify a detailed plan, gather and select information, and so on, you could focus on just one component and really make sure you're hitting all the parts of that component so that your learners are really getting a lot out of it. So maybe you just focus on identifying a detailed plan, and you just get them to really think about what they want to build, why they want to build it, how they're going to build it, and really be sure that they're ready to build before you move on. All right, so we knew what content we wanted to cover. We had our skills ready to go. But how can we do this in an inquiry-based way? Well, in my opinion, the best way to do this is with driving questions. The best way to inspire inquiry and curiosity in your learners is to model the way to ask questions. Never give them answers outright. Always try to guide them there by getting them to think about their own questions and by proposing questions to them that make them think critically. So for grade 7, our main driving question was, how can we construct a solution to the environmental, agricultural, and social needs of the future? And then in grade 8, our purpose changed a little bit because we were covering slightly different content. So we were focusing more on the heat components. So how can we create a model that demonstrates an understanding of the underlying concepts of climate change and potential responses? So these questions are what we have in mind throughout the entire workshop. No matter what point of the workshop we're at, we are going to be thinking about this overall driving question. So that is our purpose in that workshop. And then we had to decide what we actually wanted them to do. So, surprise, they're making greenhouses in their activity. So the goal was to actually have them construct or create a greenhouse. And the steps along the way were based on those skills. So construct looks a little bit different from create, wherein it takes a lot of brainstorming and identifying choices within a plan. And create is slightly different because it's less construction heavy. You also want to be choosing your timeline. And like I said, driving discovery does one skill completely in an hour. And that's a lot of work. I don't necessarily recommend this all the time, but doing an entire skill in an hour, let's say at the very beginning of the year, would be a great way to gauge where your students are with inquiry, seeing how comfortable they are, seeing if they understand the different components, seeing what they're ready to do. And then you can pick and choose those components to work on a little further throughout the year. Alternatively, it's a good option at the end of the year. Once you've gone through and you've sort of perfected each component, it's like, yes, we're so good at this component, but can we do it all together, all at once, all in one shot? So it just depends on you, depends on what you're feeling, depends on the skill you've chosen and what your main focus for that activity is. You can choose the timeline that's most appropriate. All right. So how did we include inquiry in the greenhouse effect? Well, we followed the skill. So inherently, this activity is inquiry-based. But the best way to encourage inquiry in the workshops was to let students fail. And fail they did. every time. Somebody failed every single workshop we had, and that was amazing because it showed them that it's okay to fail and that you can fail and then try again and do better the next time. So this picture is actually from the end of a workshop at Highland Park. So this was Sadie Bradbury's class. This is one of my favorite pictures from the workshop because we have such a wide array of designs here. And I want to propose a question to you. So please put your answers in the chat, and I'll have Zabrina tell me what your answers are. But do you think that this is a good example of inquiry-based learning? Was this a successful inquiry-based learning experience? And why? Or why not? So just put out any ideas that you think. Do you think that the fact that all of them are different is a good thing? Do you think it's a bad thing? I can see one at the very front there that's not quite finished, doesn't look like it got covered. The goal was to have a finished greenhouse. I don't think they actually got there. I'm not really sure what's happening with that one in the back. It doesn't look like any of the designs that we put forward to them as examples. So can we tell if this is a good inquiry-based learning experience? All right, well, Natalie says yes. Well, I think Natalie and I might be a little biased because we were both in this workshop, but absolutely yes, this was a great example of inquiry-based learning. The fact that nobody had the exact same design and nobody's design was perfect means that they were going to learn something. It means that they struggled within their team and they had to learn how to work together. They had to assign roles and they had to reflect on the fact that they maybe ran out of time or their design in a 2D form didn't quite make it to the 3D form that they were hoping. So this is what you want. You want that diversity. You want to see the different designs that your learners are putting forward. And then you want to discuss after the fact what went wrong, what they could change for next time, what they might want to modify about their design. Now, the most important thing about inquiry-based learning is asking those questions. By asking powerful inquiry questions and not giving out answers right away, you're asking your learners to think critically. But it's not always just about what you're asking. It's about how you're asking the question. It's about who you're asking the question to. It's about when you're asking the question in terms of your learning experience, and it's why you're asking. So the different types of questions you ask can elicit different connections, different answers, and different levels of inquiry in your learners. You can use questions to provoke deeper thought, to remind your learners of different connections that you want them to be making, or to see where they are with the content. So these 4 types of questions are from the Institute of Inquiry. The first is content-centered questions. Now these have you asking what your learners know. So this is pretty simple. You're just trying to gauge whether they understand the content that's been presented, whether they've got the concepts that you were hoping they get. And if they didn't, then you can go back and sort of work through it with them to figure out why they're not understanding or what might be missing or how to make them really make those connections. Then you have the process-centered questions. These questions ask you what you do. So these are really based about the skills, in my opinion. It's like, how do you construct a solution to a future problem? How do you analyze something? How do you test something fairly? So you always want to be thinking about these when you're asking learners to actually physically do something, because it gets them thinking about, oh, okay, is this the correct step? Like, if I take it this way, will I get the result that I'm hoping for? Will I find the answer that I need? Then you have your person-centered questions. So these ask what you think. There's not really a right answer to these questions. This is definitely just sort of to gauge your students' ideas, figure out what they're thinking, what they're feeling, sort of see what they're curious about and where their interests lie. And then we have other types of questions. So these have you asking your learners what they want to know. And these don't quite fit with the other types of questions because they're a little bit more broad. They sort of reinforce those cross-curricular connections. They ask your learners to make connections about what's meaningful to them and between content that they're learning. All right, so now we have a good idea of driving discovery's process. We have an idea of the types of questions you can ask. It is our job to all together try to get a learning experience together for our learners. So this here is our learning experience outline, and we'll make this available to you after the fact, this is something that you can use if it helps you to keep track of the skillification process. So you can keep track of the questions you want to ask, the different steps of the skill that you'd like to cover, and so on. So I'll show you as we go some different ways we can fill this in. But you by all means don't have to fill it in the way that I show you. You can do it for whatever makes the most sense for you and your learners. So this learning experience that I would like us to develop will focus around noise pollution. So if we're thinking about noise pollution, we're thinking about maybe some environmental problems related to noise pollution. Does anyone have any suggestions of the concepts or the outcome or indicators that we could cover with this topic? Might be putting you on the spot because we don't have the curriculum up with us right now, but that's okay. So we've chosen some for us just for the sake of timing today. And we also chose an indicator for grade 7 and an indicator for grade 8 that both use the same skill. Just for the sake of showing skillification, you definitely don't need to pick an indicator that matches between grade 7 and 8 that doesn't, aren't teaching grade 7s and grade 8s at the exact same time all the time. So just pick whichever one makes the most sense for you. But today I think we'll focus on analyze the interconnectedness of biotic and abiotic components in nature, inclusive of a Mi'kmaq perspective for grade 7, and then analyze the causes of climate change for grade 8. So we're going to start thinking about some ways that abiotic factors like noise can impact our environment, and also start thinking about how humans are impacting the environment with our noise. So once again, here's the skill. Step 2 is choose a skill, which we've kind of done by choosing those indicators. So we're going to go with analyze today. And as you can see in the right-hand corner, that the skill for analyze in grade 7 and grade 8 is exactly the same. Just if you get to grade 8 and your learners are taking off with inquiry and they're just doing a fabulous job, then you can require a little bit more of them. But essentially, the components are the same. So we are gathering and selecting information that is appropriate. We are determining accuracy, validity, and relevance of the information. We are identifying perspectives, and we are communicating our findings. So with this in mind, let's start to think about some driving questions that we could ask. Does anybody have any sort of questions that we could ask to inspire inquiry in our learners? Anything noise pollution related, anything environmental related that might spur us on in this activity? Thinking maybe if we're asking how do abiotic factors impact the environment, maybe how we can analyze the human impact on the environment, maybe how noise pollution and monitoring noise pollution is a how does noise impact how animals interact? That's great. So talking about how abiotic factors can impact different biotic factors in the environment. So all of these are great, but now that we have sort of an idea of an overall question, we want to keep asking those driving questions throughout. So you want to try to get a mix of those different 4 types of questions, and you want to keep a driving question in mind. So this is just an example, like I said, of how you could fill in this learning experience outline. Let's say you're a grade 7 teacher. You've got your subject and your unit. We've written the outcome. We might go with the driving question of how can we analyze the impact of abiotic factors in the environment, addressing the skill analyze, talking about different competencies. So these competencies listed are the ones that are inherent in doing the skill analyze. So citizenship, communication, creativity and innovation, critical thinking, personal career development, and technological fluency. We're going to try to touch on all of these competencies in the development of this learning experience. And I think we'll go with a little bit of a guided inquiry, but nothing too structured. So we'll maybe try to propose some questions to our learners, but without giving them the process of how to get there. So what should we do? What should our learners be doing? We've got our skill here. We've got the different components of analyze. Again, we don't have to do all of the components. I think maybe today we'll start with gathering and selecting information just because it's maybe a pretty easy place to start with the skill analyze. But does anyone have any suggestions, any ideas of how we could gather and select appropriate information about noise pollution in Nova Scotia. Any ideas at all? So I do have some options here. I encourage you to put some suggestions in the chat. Anything works, anything you think you would want to do with your learners. One of our options is talking about the Google Science Journal app. I'll get there in 1 second. You could also maybe have your learners do detailed observations. So what kinds of observations could we make that could help us study noise pollution in Nova Scotia? We have some data that we've collected through a citizen science project, so maybe we could examine that data together. Maybe we could talk about what that data really means. Or maybe we could frame it under the umbrella of COVID, because this is something that's currently a really big deal in everybody's lives, and it's really meaningful to talk about environmental problems in the context of what we're going through currently. So it's a great option to talk about noise pollution. So I hear that there's in the chat comparing observations between rural and urban areas. I love that. That's a great idea. Yeah, there's some decibel readings nearby. This is great. Okay, so we're going to move on to the Google Science Journal app, because this can help us do both of those things. So if you've never heard of Science Journal, I recommend you download it on your device. It's an amazing app to have. It uses your smartphone or your tablet's sensors that are integrated in the device to collect data. You can also pair your Pasco probes to Google Science Journal, and you can save experiments, and you can add as many data runs as you want, and you can share these experiments across devices. So if you go, this is the page where you can download it there. That's what it looks like. Once you've downloaded it, you can hit that little purple button at the bottom right corner with the plus in it, and that will start a new experiment. Once you're ready to start recording information in your new experiment, if you hit that second button there, the circle with the little squiggly line, that will bring up all of these sensors that your device has access to. And it just so happens that we have sound intensity, which is measured in decibels. So if we're thinking about recording decibels, we're thinking about recording different information. This is what a recorded data set would look like. So what can we notice about this data? What do we see? Is this enough information? Do we want to collect this information? Is this appropriate to what we're trying to study? If we're thinking about urban versus rural, or thinking about what the average decibel reading would be in our area, what can we learn from this page that we have? What can't we learn? What might be helpful? Maybe it would be helpful to have a picture of where this was taken. So knowing now that we're taking this reading where this truck is sitting, what are we noticing about the sound intensity? What does this tell us? What sorts of sounds do you think are being recorded? If we see a truck, we see some trees. We can't quite see it, but on the other side of those trees is the ocean. Vehicles, construction, yeah, so we're probably hearing some anthropogenic sounds, so they're not quite as natural as this area would be used to. Now, also, something that might be helpful to know is that this was taken in Cape Breton. So we now know how we can collect information. This is a compilation of some of the data that we've been able to collect. We ran a little bit of a citizen science project. We had some people send in some information about the noise level in their area. So if you were doing this with your learners, you don't need to use our chart, but what are some things that they could decide for themselves? Maybe they could decide if they want to record the type of environment that it's in. Maybe they could decide how they're going to measure the noise level, whether it is in decibels or maybe in a qualitative way. So we had a qualitative scale of 1 to 5, 1 being almost no noise and 5 being very loud. So you can do it sort of however they want based on what they think is appropriate. So maybe you find it helpful to have a spreadsheet of data that your learners can look at and sort of examine and go through and pick out the most important information to them. But maybe you find this a little overwhelming. So we could also represent the data in a slightly different way. So here we've taken the data that we had and we've put it into some graphs. Now, this may be something that you think is great for your learners right off the bat. You may want them to be the ones developing these charts or these graphs. You may want them to go out and find their own data and represent it their own way. But this is just some ways that we thought might be helpful. So does anyone see anything in this data that we could gain? Anything we can gather from this information in a meaningful way? Does this tell us anything at all? Urban equals loud, yes. Yes, and in fact, urban equals much louder than suburban and rural environments. So we had a pretty even spread, as you can see in the middle there, of what types of environments were being sent in with information. But on average, our urban environments were quite a bit louder. So that brings us to the end of this component, so gathering and selecting. So it's all about what you think is important for your learners to notice, what they think is important to collect about noise pollution. And if we're framing it in the way of how can we analyze the impact of abiotic factors on the environment, where we're considering how sound is really impacting our environments around us, this is a great activity for them to just go out and start collecting what they think is important. We've got some driving questions here. But once we have our data or we have some information, what can we do to get our learners to think critically about it? Because it's one thing to know that urban environments are louder than suburban or rural environments, but what does that really mean? And can we be sure that the data that we got is accurate? So what are some things that we could ask to get our learners thinking about the information presented? What are some things we want them to notice? Maybe asking them about the problems with qualitative data. So what are some problems with asking people to rank from 1 to 5? Do you think that your 2 out of 5 on a noise scale would be the same as mine? Or what about your 2 out of 5 at 7 a.m. versus 7 p.m.? It's subjective, exactly. So getting them to notice the problems with something that's subjective, notice that not everybody would qualify things in the same way. Even when we have something that's quantitative, like the decibel level, you still want them thinking about, okay, well, what does this mean? And is it a bird singing nearby? How far was this data taken away from the noise source? Does that impact the data? Getting them to really explore that with their Google Science Journal or by asking them those questions and really get them thinking critically so that they can understand if this is data that can be used in a meaningful way. Yes, that's another great point, is making sure that your data can be used again later on. So making sure that you're not asking questions and getting data that's so specific to right now that it doesn't really apply in the future. Now, another really great way to identify how the information is important or relevant is by presenting phenomena. So by exploring different phenomena, you can help your learners make connections between what they're learning and things that are happening in the real world. Essentially, phenomena-based learning is a type of inquiry-based learning where you present a phenomena and you require your learners to figure out what's happening. You require them to make larger connections without giving them the answer. So you sort of just present something that's happening. You say, oh, what do you notice? What is going on here? Can this help you in analyzing your data? So one great example of a phenomena that we can talk about, especially in terms of noise pollution, is the example of the Beaufort Sea. So they were measuring how far sound travels in the ocean. And in the Beaufort Sea, 10 years ago versus today, today the sound underwater can travel 4 times as far as 10 years ago. So what's happening there? What does that mean? Why is this happening? How can we be sure this is happening? What does this mean for our future? What is this monitoring? What can this be used for? So all of these questions are great to be asking our learners, and without telling them anything about this study, without explaining away what's happening, you can get them thinking about what it could mean, what it is valuable for. Now, does anyone have any other suggestions of different sort of phenomena that you could present to your learners about noise pollution or something that's sound related in the environment? What else could we look at? All right, I'm going to show you one of my favorites. This actually was something that BBC published on Friday, so it's very recent. I'm going to open it up. Just bear with me for a second here. So, without reading too much of the article before we start watching, I'm going to play this animation for you. So as I play this, we'll play it a couple times. So just have a look at what's happening. Have a look at what's being measured, what's changing, what information you can get from this, what's now happening up in the corner there, what information is being presented, maybe what information isn't being presented. And you can start to notice that things are changing. So what's changing? How fast is it changing? Why do you think it's changing? Awesome, there we go. So I'm going to fast forward sort of towards the end here again, and you can watch as things start to fall off. So our data spikes are getting lower and lower and lower. What is being recorded? Can anyone tell? So what sort of information was this showing us? Well, if we look up at the top here, so this is talking about the seismic noise of social distancing. And somebody suggested rush hour traffic. Yeah, that's great. It could be. And how can we tell how that's changing, or why is that changing? So notice as we're entering lockdown, what does that mean for our noise levels and why? Yes, exactly. Yeah. So people aren't moving around as much. So our noise levels are dropping off because people are staying home more. Less travel, yeah. So people aren't moving around as much. They aren't out in their cars as much. Now, do you notice any trends or any patterns as places start to enter lockdown? Do they immediately drop off? Maybe it's a little hard to tell whether things are dropping off quickly, but would you expect that the first places to go into lockdown would be the first ones to be quieter? Yes, yes, exactly. And then you can see, for some reason, this part of Europe is still the loudest after everything has gone quiet. So that's just, I'll leave it there. But this is just a great way to start getting your learners thinking. Oh, there we go. Getting your learners thinking about different things that are happening and why it's relevant. So you can collect noise pollution information or you can collect decibel readings all you want, but unless you have a reason or unless you're trying to figure something out, it's not really doing anything. So once you can present something to them that makes it meaningful, that makes them think about it, makes them really reflect on what that information is for, you can do a lot more with it. And again, this is just an example of how you could fill in our inquiry-based learning template. So we've included a couple of the steps by considering what other information could be useful to the study, determining how data collection methods could be improved. So you can have them suggest ways that the study could be better by examining different environmental phenomena or just different phenomena happening and interpreting that importance for noise pollution and environmental health. And again, some more driving questions. And again, if you have any questions that you'd like to propose or anything you think would be great to go through, feel free to put those in the chat. Love to hear what you are thinking. Now, moving on to the next component, how can we identify perspectives? What does it mean to identify perspectives? what are some perspectives or some things that are represented by this data specifically? Well, I can tell you that my perspective is represented because I did a lot of the data collection. We can tell that Halifax County had the most data being put forward. So a lot of what's happening in the Halifax County would be represented, but we had several places with no data at all. So we're missing that perspective. We're missing what's happening in other parts of the province. Now, why might we not get data from certain areas of the province? What could be happening there? Yes, exactly. Halifax County has half the population of the province. So we have much more people here. We have a lot more chance to be out walking down the street, taking a cool noise reading of downtown. We also have most of the county has internet, good internet access, access to technology. So you might be thinking that certain areas just don't have access to that sort of thing. They maybe didn't have access to the Discovery Center putting out our notice of data collection. They may not have been able to log on to the computer to submit their data. So these are all things to think about. And other perspectives that we can start to appreciate are cultural perspectives. So it's really important to be thinking about the backgrounds of your learners and also the backgrounds of everybody in the province for what this data actually means. So how do you think we can remind learners of the concept of netagulig when it comes to noise pollution and this data collection? So the concept of netagulig, for anyone who's not entirely comfortable or familiar with it, it's telling us that all living things are connected. We also learned that the environment lives in a balance, and anything that we are doing as humans can disrupt this balance. So how can we get learners to think about what this noise reading means for disrupting the balance in our natural environments? Do we think that we're living in balance with the environment if our noise pollution is way through the roof? For maybe like a hotspot like Halifax, it's interesting to think about, okay, we're not quite in balance with the environment if all of our actions are, polluting the environment in some way. Another thing to think about when you're identifying perspectives is who is most negatively impacted by the data that's being presented. So we can see that some areas have hotspots of noise pollution. Who do you think might be most negatively impacted by things like noise pollution? Think about who typically would be in the loudest parts of town. Animals, yeah, animals would be very negatively impacted, but maybe not all the same. So maybe some animals aren't as impacted by it, but maybe in our oceans, our whales are very negatively impacted by things like noise pollution. In fact, some whales get separated from their pods because it's so loud that they can't communicate with each other. Another group that might be negatively impacted would be people who have to work shift work or a lot of heavy labor. They would be much more negatively impacted by sound and a noisy life in their job than someone who works, say, in an office. And one more would be anyone who's living with autism or a sensitivity to sound. So someone who is highly sensitive to sound would struggle a little bit more with walking downtown Halifax. They might have to think about a few more things than someone like me who's not as sensitive to sound. All right, so again, we've got our template filled in here. We've got a couple of options. Again, feel free to give any other suggestions that you have, any questions that you might want to ask. And then our final point is communicating our findings. So this is where I need your help mostly, is determining how you want to have your learners communicate their findings. So we thought it would be cool to prepare a map so we can visually represent the data. This is an option, of course, if you want to do this with your learners, but what are some other ways that you could have them communicate findings? This might depend on your purpose for the activity. So you may want them to be really understanding the environmental impact, so they could do a little bit of an assessment of how the noisiest places may be impacting their environments around them. Or maybe this is a comparison of quantitative and qualitative information. So they could go through and represent how the decibel level sometimes matches up with a number on a scale, but sometimes doesn't, and they could talk about why. Maybe they could put forth some ideas of how to minimize the impact of noise pollution in the province. So yeah, there are lots of ideas. I'm gonna maybe exit my screen now, and we only have 8 minutes left, but I will open the floor to any questions that anyone has, or if anyone didn't get their point across, if you'd like to send out your suggestions or your comments, feel free to do that in the chat. Or maybe if anyone wants to share a particularly interesting inquiry-based learning experience that they've had, or something that worked really well for their students, now would be a great time to share something like that as well. Mm. The way that it's presented. Yeah, well, maybe I'll share one more time, just because what I thought was funny was how dark Inverness County is. I don't know if you can tell or could tell when it was up the first time, but Inverness is almost as loud as Halifax. Anybody have any idea why that might be? So again, that first reading that I showed you with the truck, that was taken in Inverness. So maybe nobody would really be able to tell, but yes, that's great. Yeah, so there's a lot of mining activity. Farming activity could be very loud. Sampling bias, yes. Was that Adam that said sampling bias? Yes. So thank you, Adam. For those of you who I guess maybe wouldn't know Adam, but he's another member of the Discovery Center team. And he actually is the only person who submitted data from Cape Breton. So he gave us all our data points for up in Inverness County and Victoria County as well. And I think Adam had some fun with trying to find the loudest areas to measure. So this is an awesome point to bring up with your learners as well, is like, that's a perspective that's represented, is Adam trying to get the coolest noise reading. And I know for myself as well, in Halifax, I was trying to represent what I thought were the noisiest levels, because I thought that would be cooler to have a darker spot on the map. But that's not always a fair way to get data. Yes, yes, we will be sharing that. I will share the filled in version with you, as well as the blank learning experience template. I do believe the blank learning experience template is currently available on the Moodle under the Driving Discovery resource page. We'll explain more about that tomorrow and how to access those resources. But yes, for sure, we'll make those available in the slide deck section of the SLA website. All right. Are there any more questions? Anything that I maybe didn't answer? Anything I didn't touch on that somebody'd like to talk about? Oh, I see somebody said wind too. That's a really great point. So some of my noisiest readings were actually just because the wind was blowing. And when I did my very first reading, I was in the woods, and it was louder than when I was at like the front of the Discovery Center downtown Halifax. So it's just about the types of noise. So that's something really important to think about too, is if you want to be collecting different data, that's why it's important to think about the way you're describing it or the information you're including. Yes, sample size. Yeah, how can we really tell, like get a good picture of what a whole county looks like if we only have one reading? Yes, yeah. And so Zabrina's mentioning that New Brunswick is a really good example of that, because we only got one reading for New Brunswick. So it's maybe not representative of the entire province, but it was the only data point we had. Awesome. Yes, that is so. That's the goal, really, is to get them thinking about their own questions, and really going through those different types of questions with them can help them do that. So if you're nervous about letting your students guide their own inquiry, it would be really great to just work on practicing developing those questions with them. And we haven't used ArcGIS with this data, but I'm sure we could. Yeah. No, the map that we made was just on Microsoft Paint, so. Yes, it's definitely harder for them at the beginning of the year. But yeah, all of that practice really pays off. And I can tell you from my experience in the classrooms is going in September, the students don't know what they're doing. And they're too scared to ask questions or to get things wrong. But the more that you encourage them, by the end of the year, the schools that we're at in June, those kids they don't even care. They want to ask the questions. They want to find their own answers. They want to put it in their own perspective. Share ideas of how teachers are able to access resources to support inquiry-based learning in their classroom. Yes, so I think the biggest thing for driving discovery is just going to the Moodle where our resources are. We also have some extensions of our workshops, ideas for ways to run the workshops yourself, different questions you can ask. And we also will be developing more PD opportunities, so just stay tuned for those in terms of driving discovery. Yes, definitely. I know there's lots of inquiry-based learning resources out there. It's the good thing about it becoming more common is that there are lots of places online to find good resources. And then anything that we do for driving discovery is specific to grade 7 and 8, but those concepts carry on into high school, and the questions, the way that you're asking questions are applicable across any grade. All right. Yeah, no, Natalie, that would be a really cool idea. And yeah, framing the research or the study in terms of different cultural backgrounds, different perspectives is really important. And it's really interesting as a project for students to get to know how things are changing and how things are different for different cultural backgrounds. All right, I think we have under a minute left. So Zabrina, is there anything else you want to say?
I don't think so.
All right, well, I guess I will just say thank you everyone for joining us. If you have any questions, reach out to us. The link to the Moodle is in the, what was that? On the e-learning site. Again, if you tune in tomorrow, we'll go over a little bit more of how to access that. If you're unable to tune in tomorrow, there will be another driving discovery PowerPoint that we upload, and it'll have the steps in there as well.